For decades, cheap gas was the invisible foundation of Europe's economic comfort. Homes stayed warm, factories stayed productive, and governments promised stability without asking hard questions about dependency. Austria, like many European countries, built its energy system around the assumption that Russian gas would always be there, affordable, reliable, and politically manageable. That assumption has now collapsed. What we are witnessing today is not just an energy crisis, but the end of an era. As winter approaches, Austria finds itself facing a harsh reality. Energy bills are rising, industrial costs are climbing, and ordinary households are feeling pressure they have not experienced in generations. The idea of cheap gas has quietly disappeared, replaced by uncertainty and fear. This is not happening in isolation. It is part of a much larger geopolitical shift in which Russia is turning away from Europe and redirecting its energy power toward the East. For years, Austria positioned itself as a neutral energy hub. Long-term contracts with Russian suppliers allowed Austrian companies and consumers to enjoy some of the lowest gas prices in Europe. These agreements were seen as pragmatic rather than political. Energy, many believed, existed outside of geopolitics. That belief was comfortable, and wrong. The moment conflict reshaped relations between Russia and the West, energy became a weapon, a bargaining chip, and a strategic tool. Sanctions, counter-sanctions, broken trust, and political pressure transformed gas from a simple commodity into a symbol of power. Pipelines that once represented cooperation now represent division. Austria's dependence on Russian gas was not accidental. It was the result of decades of policy choices focused on price, efficiency, and short-term economic gain. Alternatives were discussed, but rarely prioritized. Renewable energy expanded, but not fast enough to replace baseload gas. Storage existed, but not at levels designed for prolonged disruption. When the supply shock came, Austria was exposed. Meanwhile, Russia was already preparing for a different future. Long before the current crisis reached its peak, Moscow had begun investing heavily in eastern routes. Pipelines toward China, liquefied natural gas terminals aimed at Asian markets, and long-term energy partnerships with countries less interested in Western political pressure quietly took shape. Europe assumed Russia needed European buyers more than Europe needed Russian gas. That assumption, too, has proven dangerously flawed. As Europe debated unity and sanctions, Russia accelerated its pivot eastward. Asia's energy demand continues to grow rapidly, and countries there are willing to sign long-term contracts without the political conditions attached by the European Union. From Russia's perspective, the East offers stability, scale, and strategic independence. For Austria, the consequences are immediate and painful. Gas prices fluctuate wildly, forcing governments to step in with subsidies, emergency measures, and public reassurances. Industries that rely on affordable energy, chemicals, metals, manufacturing, face difficult choices. Some reduce output, others consider relocation, a few shut down entirely. Each decision ripples through the economy, affecting jobs, supply chains, and public confidence. Households feel the impact in quieter but equally serious ways. Heating costs rise, electricity bills increase, families adjust habits, lower thermostats, and cut spending elsewhere. Energy poverty, once a marginal issue, becomes a mainstream concern. Governments urge conservation, but conservation alone cannot replace missing supply. Politically, the crisis tests Europe's unity. Wealthier states can afford larger subsidies. Smaller or more energy-dependent countries struggle. Austria finds itself balancing domestic pressure with European commitments, national interest with collective strategy. The promise of shared sacrifice sounds different when winter temperatures drop and bills arrive. At the same time, the idea of returning to cheap Russian gas becomes politically impossible. Trust has been broken on both sides. Even if pipelines were reopened tomorrow, the assumption of stability is gone. Governments now view dependency as a vulnerability, not a benefit. Energy security has replaced price as the primary concern. This shift comes at a cost. Liquefied natural gas from distant suppliers is more expensive. Infrastructure takes time to build. Renewable energy requires massive investment, storage solutions, and grid modernization. None of this happens overnight. The transition away from cheap gas is not smooth or painless. It is disruptive by nature. Russia, on the other hand, adapts in a different way. Redirecting gas eastward does not happen instantly, but the long-term trajectory is clear. New pipelines are planned. LNG capacity expands. Energy diplomacy replaces European markets with Asian ones. In this new landscape, Europe is no longer the center of Russia's energy strategy. This does not mean Russia escapes consequences. Redirecting flows involves costs, discounts, and logistical challenges. But the strategic message is clear. Russia is willing to endure short-term losses to achieve long-term independence from Western pressure. Austria and Europe face a harder challenge. They must rebuild energy systems that took decades to form, under conditions of crisis rather than stability. Every decision now carries political, economic, and social consequences. Move too slowly, and vulnerability remains. Move too fast, and costs explode. The end of cheap gas also forces uncomfortable questions about past choices. Why were warnings ignored? Why was dependency normalized? Why did diversification remain a slogan rather than a strategy? These questions have no easy answers, but they shape future policy. What is certain is that the old energy world is gone. The assumptions of the past no longer apply. Austria freezing is not just about temperature, it is about the cold shock of reality. Energy is power, and power is political. As Russia turns east, Europe turns inward, reassessing priorities, values, and vulnerabilities. The transition will define the next generation of European politics and economics. Whether it leads to resilience or decline depends on decisions made now, under pressure, without the comfort of cheap gas to soften the consequences. This is not a temporary crisis. It is a structural shift. Cheap energy fueled Europe's growth for decades. Its disappearance marks the beginning of a more complex, more expensive, and more competitive global energy era. Austria is simply one of the first to feel the cold. And as winter deepens, the question is no longer whether cheap gas will return, but whether Europe can adapt fast enough to survive without it.